Welcome. Hello. I think you're out there now. We've opened up the doors of the house, so to speak, of the Zoom room. Welcome. I want to thank you, the audience, first for sharing their afternoon, evening, or early morning hours, depending on your time zone. Thank you for sharing your time with us and overcoming Zoom fatigue and joining us for this conversation. It's very special to be live with you. The only thing that's more special to us is to be live in person with you. So I hope you will be able to join us in the fall for the Neuroverse Festival, which we will be putting on in the fall around these same issues, neuroscience, AI, and the human-machine relationship. So please try to come and join us there, or there will be parts of it virtual. That's the silver lining of COVID. We know how we can share more globally. So follow us on Instagram, Media Art Explore, all one word with no E's, okay? So I also want to thank, while we're settling in here, our partner in presenting this series, 1014, A Space for Ideas. They're a wonderful partner to have, and they have a very European into Asia following, so it's great to have them as a partner. And I want to also in the background will be Emily Riley, my colleague, who will be posting relevant links as they come up in the conversation. She's our equivalent to a proprietary AI platform who's like scanning the internet as they speak to come up with the links. So, and just to let you know who I am, I'm Kay Matchlot, the founding producer director of Media Art Exploration, known as MAX. And we produce and present live arts at the intersection of science and technology and the human experience. And we do this on both coasts and work with artists and we are lucky enough to work with artists and scientists from around the world. Today, we are hosting this event from Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape, and recognize New York City as a past, present, and future crossroads for many Indigenous people. So thank you for joining us. This is our first forum of MAXforum, and the next one will be March 14th, called the Interspecies Quest, and April 18th, the Imagination and the Scientists. So I hope you'll join us then. I want to thank our funders for this series, Science Sandbox, an initiative of the Simons Foundation, and an anonymous donor who I think is out there. We send our thanks to you. So as this conversation rolls, you'll be seeing things in the chat box. You can post your questions. So today I'm delighted to have these three significant human intelligences with me. And we're going to talk about the promise and perils of this moment, of this dynamic intersection between human and machine intelligence and the person and the machine. And these people do work that looks into the circuitry of both those things, all those things. So we're delighted to have them today to talk to us about that work and the terrain they're in. So I'm going to ask you, Max, Emily's writing under the guise of Max, will post their bios and links to their bios for you to get the details of these three people. But I want them to introduce themselves today so you can get more of a sense of them, since we're lucky enough to have them live. So we're going to start with Tom Griffiths, the director of Princeton's Cognitive Science Institute. We'll then move on to artist and MacArthur Fellow Annie Dorsen, and then to Grayson Earle, a MAXmachina 2020 resident artist and hacker and teacher. And side note, two things. One is MAXmachina grants for 2021 are open until March 1st. If you might have a project that's suitable for the Neuroverse, please check it out. And also, quick note, Grayson is going to show an excerpt in his introduction of a video game that does contain adult language and violence. And now I'm going to hand it over to Tom to start the introduction, to start the beginning. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kay. So As a professor, it's hard for me to talk without a screen behind me showing some slides, so I'm going to do that. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to have the chance to have this conversation. And I think where I'm coming from is I'm a cognitive scientist. I'm somebody who thinks all the time about what the mathematical principles are behind human cognition, trying to figure out how to make better computational models of how human minds work and relate that to the way that we make our machines solve problems. And one of the things that cognitive scientists are really interested in is answering a question of what it is that makes humans unique. And this is a question that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. So there's a kind of classic answer from Aristotle, who thought about humans as being distinctively animals that think. But that kind of answer is something which is really kind of dated. It's something which goes back to an era where the comparison class that we had was animals. And nowadays we have a very different comparison class, which is machines. And so I think, when we start to sit down and think about what human minds are and how human minds work, there's a really interesting idea here that perhaps human intelligence is going to be something which will be a distinctive flavor of intelligence, even as we develop super intelligent machines. And I think the reason why I think that is that if we actually look at the kinds of problems that human minds have to solve, these human computational problems are characterized by some of the constraints, some of the limitations that are the things that, are the way that human beings work. So if I kind of make a list of my top 3 limitations for characterizing how human minds work. So number 1 is that humans have limited time. We have to live in this world for a limited period. There's only so much data we can acquire, so many actions that we can take. A human lifespan defines a natural period over which our intelligence has to operate. Number 2, humans have a limited amount of computation. We can only use as much computation as we can carry around inside our heads. And that limited computation means that we have to be masters of being able to solve challenging new problems using solutions we've discovered in the past, using the limited resources that we have. And number 3, that humans have limited communication, that we can't get around these constraints of time and computation by taking our brain state and copying it to somebody else to share the data that we have, or by putting our minds together in a mind merge that allows us to bring in more computational resources. So these kinds of constraints mean that the problems that human minds have to solve are very different from the problems that machines have to solve. And one illustration of this comes from a blog post that was put out by the AI company OpenAI. This is just a picture that shows the relationship between, as time passes on the horizontal axis here, the amount of computation that has gone into various AI breakthroughs on the vertical axis here. And I'm not going to go into the details, but the basic idea here is you can see that's a straight line, but that's a straight line on a logarithmic scale, which means that there's been an exponential increase in the amount of computation that's being used in current AI systems. So the amount of data that they're using and the amount of computation that they're using is increasing extremely rapidly. It's doubling every 3 months or so, in a way that means that the solutions that those AI systems are finding are very different perhaps from the kinds of solutions that human minds have to find in terms of not having to navigate these kinds of constraints. So when we look at these constraints that characterize how human minds work, I think one thing that's interesting about them is that in many ways, they're a consequence of the fact that we're biological organisms that are constrained in what we're able to do by the biology that we have. And so this perhaps gives us a different way of thinking about this classic answer to what it is that makes humans unique. So rather than being animals that think, it emphasizes the fact that we're animals that think. Thank you.
Annie, you're up.
Hi. Thank you, Kay, for inviting me to take part in this, and Tom, that's so interesting. So by way of introduction, I kind of want to start by introducing you to the kind of first theater piece that I made that used computation. This was back in 2010. And it's before I've been calling the work that I do algorithmic theater, and I hadn't yet arrived at that name for what I was working on when I made this. So I'll introduce this piece and then maybe we'll get to what is algorithmic theater. So this piece is called Hello, Hi There, and it is kind of a riff on the televised debate between Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault from the early 70s. I was talking with a composer friend about doing something with that text, and she introduced me to the famous essay by Alan Turing called On Computing Machinery and Intelligence, which is from 1950, and is a kind of foundational text for the field of natural language programming. My friend introduced me to that essay because a lot of the subject matter of the debate between Chomsky and Foucault has to do with the relationship between language and consciousness and how language interacts with thinking. And that, of course, is very much what Alan Turing's essay is also about. Very briefly, the thrust of that essay is that since humans really don't know what thinking is, that we don't quite know how it's done, what we're doing when we think, how you could break down the process of thought into parts that you might be able to attack, computationally. It might be, this is 1950, remind you, it might be kind of a foolish exercise to try to create the product thinking, right, in a machine. That may be a better approach would be to try to create the illusion of thinking, or the effect of thinking. So that's kind of the, the starting bell for the entire field in a way of natural language processing, which is about trying to program computers to be able to spit out plausible sounding human conversation. When I read that essay and played around with some little online chatbots, as they're called, little softwares that try to do this kind of conversational back and forth with humans, I thought, this is theater. It's about creating an illusion. It's about using text to create something like a realistic seeming consciousness purely through language, which in a way is what a play is. So maybe let's look at the clip and then I'll say a little bit afterwards about some of my more recent work.
Imagine a game. A man and a woman are having a talk. There is a third person reading their dialogue in a separate room. The object of the game is for the reader to determine which is the man and which is the woman. He knows them by labels A and B, and at the end of the game he says either is a man and B is a woman, or is a woman and B is a man. What will happen when a machine takes the part of the man in this game? Will the reader get it wrong as often when the game is played like this as he does when the game is played between two people? This question replaces the old, can machines think?
I love games.
You're going to lose.
Thanks a lot for telling me I am going to lose.
You're very welcome.
I think we better define our terms.
By we do you mean you and me?
Yes, I mean us.
Oh, thanks for explaining that. Does us mean the US or us?
Oh, I think it depends on the context.
Great.
Who was that guy?
In this context, I don't have enough information to answer your question.
Who was the guy introducing Chomsky and Foucault?
Hans Elders is the moderator of the debate.
From 1968 to 1974, Fons Elders was philosophically concerned with the ontological question and the epistemological question.
Fons Elders looks like Walter Becker. The Chomsky-Foucault debate hosted by Walter Becker from Steely Dan.
Do you like Steely Dan?
I love Steely Dan.
Are you real and in the ears?
I do not know whether I am real and in the ears. I am encased in a box.
Just kidding.
H-A-H-A-H-A-H-A-H-A.
I'm glad you find it amusing.
Cool. So, so that was, really the starting point for all of my work over the last decade. And that piece is obviously a lot about sort of this question of imitation of human dialogue. As I researched more about the technology involved, I started getting increasingly interested in the algorithm itself. How do algorithms sort and sequence information? And I started thinking of this as a kind of algorithmic dramaturgy. So I made a few pieces in this vein that were really looking into different, in some ways kind of name brand or like famous algorithms that sort, sequence, or sift information in different ways, and what kinds of theatrical or dramatic structures those algorithms proposed. In the last year or two, I started wondering how I might like to work with machine learning algorithms, or how I might not like to, and whether I could find a way to sort of enter into a conversation a little bit with some of the deep learning techniques that have been more popular in the last few years. So I'm currently planning a new project, which I guess we're going to talk about more over the next hour, but I'll just kind of very briefly give you like the elevator pitch soundbite about what it is for our later conversation. Some of you probably have read about new language prediction models. Some of them are called GPT-3. There's a few other ones, but they are very powerful natural language programs that can produce extremely plausible text, some more than others, and sometimes more plausible than other times. But they often work on a prompt. So if you give them a little piece of text, they will kind of provide additional text that might plausibly follow from the prompt you gave. So I'm going to use a fragment of a play by Aeschylus from the 5th century BC that was part of his trilogy on Prometheus, on the Prometheus myth. And this play, there's only one little line that remains. The rest of it's been lost. So my collaborators and I are going to use that remaining fragment as a prompt and see what, we working with the GPT-3 language model might come up with that would kind of fill in the rest of the play, working kind of forwards and backwards from that line. So with that, I will hand over to Grayson.
Thank you. I love that video so much. I can't wait to watch more of it. I also want to preface this by saying I have a very funny kind of camera problem that might surface where I'll turn blurry, but fear not. I'll probably have to fix it by going like this, but it'll be all right. I created this project called BailBlock a few years ago. There's a slide for this. I like to bring this project up because it's a computer program that bails people out of jail. It mines cryptocurrency across a network of volunteer computers and then uses the coins generated in that process to be put towards bail for people who can't afford it. And so this is emblematic of my art practice in the sense that it's a kind of contestational software. Oh no. There we go. It's a kind of contestational software. It's a misappropriation of technology that is intended to point to the central assumptions of the system in question. So in this case, it points to a morally corrupt justice system that benefits those with money over those who do not have it. And it points to the politics of financial systems like cryptocurrencies that are vehicles for these injustices, and questions, whether or not something like Bitcoin is really a revolutionary financial system when it benefits the same cast of characters. So as Kay mentioned, I'm an artist in residence at Media Art Exploration. And as part of this, I've created 2 videos. One is usefulness of a useless neural network, in which I train a neural network to add 2 numbers together by supplying it with massive amounts of data, as you usually train a machine learning algorithm to do. And as it turns out, the network gets pretty good, but you end up with these sort of like fuzzy results, like 2 + 2 = 3.9. And I use this as a way to kind of talk about the process of optimization and machine learning actually also being a process of forgetting as you like optimize the network. And then the other video is called "Why Don't the Cops Fight Each Other?" And this follows my attempts to make the police fight each other in the video game Grand Theft Auto 5. This sort of behavior is trivial to modify if the subject is a civilian. So in other words, I can make 2 civilians fight each other, no problem. I can make 2 deer fight each other in the game. But the allegiances of the police officers in the game happens at a level of the code that it's immutable without changing something like very sort of deep in the kernel of the game's engine. And so in this way, I'm looking at what sorts of politics are embedded in AI systems, not just in the data used to train the system, but in a more sort of like fundamental way, noticing or bringing to the surface that computers and software are cultural products And so their construction will share the same sort of assumptions that our culture shares. They'll share assumptions with our culture. So you can play this clip, and as Kay mentioned, there is some kind of simulated violence.
Let's go, hotshot! Asshole. Bullshit! I can fight too, you know? Son of a bitch! Suspect taken down! Stay down, motherfucker!
Thank you all very much for coming today and introducing yourselves. I also want to ask the audience, if you're of a mind, put where you're logging in from in the chat, because we'd love to know where we're reaching around the globe, because it's not necessarily clear from the emails you leave on Eventbrite. So Grayson, I wanted to just say, what you didn't go in knowing you'd find this bias in the code, if you will. What made you go in and tinker with Grand Theft Auto, and what were you looking for?
Well, it's such a robust simulation to begin with. You know, it just seems like, and other artists have used this modified Grand Theft Auto to produce, yeah, some kind of like theatrical pieces or live simulations or whatever you want to call them. And you know, there was a lot going on, especially in New York City and sort of activism when, you know, people were looking at what the police were doing. And so I kind of wanted to create a cathartic video art piece that just sort of set up two police officers to fight one another as a kind of antithesis to the violence that they enact on other people. And then, of course, after trying to do this for a while and running into all of these problems, it became clear that it was actually impossible. And then what's kind of interesting is I start to ask people questions on forums, like including the people who make the tools for modifying this game, and then enter into a kind of dialogue with them, because then they say like, wait a second, you really can't do that? Oh, that's so interesting. And then like now there's this sort of like knowledge in this community around, yeah, questioning this sort of this assumption that's been projected onto the game world, right? That that the police need to be this kind of like immutable, you know, monolithic force or something.
So you have perhaps a more adversarial relationship with the algorithm. You all three have deep relationships with algorithms, but would you say yours is more adversarial?
I don't know about more adversarial. I mean, yeah, maybe like it certainly is like more explicitly adversarial or something. I mean, we're all in our own ways, I think, looking at how these things came to be and then using them as like a lens through which to look back at ourselves and back at the things that constructed them. And so, yeah, I think that we all share this sort of like criticality for sure.
I want to come back to what it tells us about ourselves, but Tom, you wrote a book called Algorithms to Live By. So you have the algorithms have something that we can bring to human cognition, human intelligence, human life that benefits us in a sense.
Yeah, although I think one of the themes of that book was actually really this idea that, you know, we need to think about the kind of computational constraints that human minds operate under. So when we're used to thinking about kind of like descriptions of rational action, right? Like what it is that we're supposed to do, how it is we're supposed to do things like making decisions. The normal way that we think about that is using a kind of economic lens, which focuses on, you know, just doing the right thing, you know, making exactly the right decision, choosing the right option, maximizing your expected utility. And that perspective is one that doesn't take into account how hard it is to think about doing the right thing, right? It doesn't take into account the sort of computational costs that are involved in thinking about, you know, what it is that's the right action to take. And so a consequence of that is that, you know, when we start to take into account these computational constraints that human minds operate under, something like computer science is actually a better guide to rational behavior, where it kind of, because what a computer scientist wants to do is to think about how to make a machine think the least amount possible in order to solve a problem, right? That's what all the computer science is about, is trying to make algorithms that are efficient and making you have to do less work. And so if that's the kind of thing that you hold up as a standard, those are the kinds of algorithms that we talked about in the book, is like, here are what the optimal solutions look like, and in many ways sort of taking into account those computational costs.
But you said that they're doubling the amount of data they go through every 3 months. So is that a sustainable intellectual technique?
So yeah, so it's something where I think the way that I think about that is that a lot of current work in artificial intelligence is effectively it's buying the future, right? So if you, there are exponential scaling laws in computer science. It's the most famous one is Moore's law, which says, you know, the amount of processing power we expect to have should double every 18 months. But if the amount of data that we're using is doubling every 3 months, the amount of computation that we need to process that amount of data is doubling every 3 months, then that means that we're sort of piling in more computational resources at a rate which is faster than Moore's law. And so that's not sustainable. That's something where increasingly, you know, huge amounts of money and energy are going into training AI systems. And the reason for that is competition, which is driving companies to build better and better AI systems. But that's sort of justifying putting the resources into it. But as I said, they're sort of buying the future. They're spending the money to get ahead of the curve that's the curve that we'd normally expect to characterize increases in processing power.
And what about, so Grayson, you uncovered this, what you call a bias. There's been a lot of work on bias, artists and thinkers and social scientists investigating the bias of data sets. Is bias ever an advantage? Is bias, like, does an artist bring bias? Where does bias sit now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question. And it's been kind of, my thoughts on this have been complicated by Tom's work, which I'll, you know, ask about in a second. I mean, yeah, I'm definitely thinking about the biases of these systems, but not just in terms of the data that they're being fed, which has been explored by artists like Kate Crawford and Trevor Paglen, and looking at like how these kind of surveillance systems categorize people, and how that's, you know, going to be racist, for example, because they're trained by human beings, and we have a problem with racism. And so when people are labeling photographs, they bring that in. And this is true, and this is a problem. But even the kind of like non-data logic of the software or hardware system can also like have a sort of bias. Like it could be geared towards efficiency, for example, which is like a very, you know, invisible bias to some, but it's something that is like comes from a capitalistic culture. But what's sort of complicated this for me from Tom is also thinking about the word bias in a broad view, which is to say that like bias is not necessarily a bad thing. It certainly can be, but that it's sort of always present. And he should talk about this to do it more justice, I think.
Yeah, I think what Grayson's referring to is we had a conversation before about the role of what are called inductive biases in machine learning. So if you think about the problems that human minds have to solve, right? We have limited amounts of data. We have to make inferences from the small amounts of information that are around us. That's something which requires us to kind of like go beyond the data in some way. We have to make some kind of educated guesses about what the underlying causes of things are and what hypotheses are true when we're trying to solve any kind of learning or inference problem. And so to a machine learning researcher, everything other than the data that influences the conclusions that you reach is called inductive bias. And so one of the things that I do as a cognitive scientist is try and figure out what are the inductive biases of humans like, so we can think about putting those into machines. And those are biases that in some sense are good insofar as they help us to reach conclusions, at least to the extent that they're aligned with whatever the actual state of things is in the world. And so this is, you know, kind of like, I think about it as a key characteristic of any learning system is this question of like, well, how is it solving these gaps between what you want to know and the data that you have? And that's the space where bias comes in.
Okay, I want to come back to that, but I want to, Annie, it seems to me in your algorithmic theater that you approach this from both angles, that you kind of unpack the limitations of natural language processing, and you unpack the limitations of the human beings, whether it be Chomsky and Foucault talking, or Aeschylus writing, or are interpreting Aeschylus now. So you seem, to me, you come at this from both angles. Is that fair to say?
Maybe it is. I mean, and that might be a product of me being a kind of a theater person, where there's an effort in a way to sort of capture something about what it feels like to be alive right now. So I often say that what I'm really working on is like, how do we live with these tools? How do human people with our, flawed and limited and yet sort of wonderful ways of thinking and being interact more intimately with the tools that we've created? So I am looking at how the tools create us, we create them. There's this back and forth process. But it's interesting, this notion of the gap. Just speaking of Chomsky, that notion of the gap is a really key part of Chomsky's linguistics and his theory of language, but also his political commitments, in the sense that he bases a lot of his optimism for the world on this notion that as humans, we get a very limited amount of input before we start doing wonderful things with that input, before we start outputting much more than we've taken in, right? So that means the amount of language that you hear as a child or as an infant is pretty limited. And from that, you have potentially infinite numbers of things that you can say. And so there's always this surplus that we produce. That's what Chomsky means when he talks about creativity. And it also, is how he thinks about our, his optimism about our capacity to improve our social relations and improve our living conditions. He bases this on the kind of structural creativity that we are all, heirs to, that we are all born with.
But also the machines, Chomsky and Foucault, if anybody goes back and watches the piece, they also were talking at each other in a certain way. So I thought the machines, when they were talking at each other, were sort of mirroring Chomsky and Foucault in a very interesting, funny way.
Yeah, I mean, there's a joke about that debate that it's, you have these two incredibly interesting people, and the talk is sometimes considered like a great example of the power of conversation to not produce new thinking.
It's sort of some of our limitations in right? Tom, just back to this bias question for a second. I want to get in filling in trying to, and correct me if I'm putting this wrong, filling in for data is this inductive bias possibility. Is that so that there's this new tributary or development in machine learning, or learning machines as they're coming to be called, that the inductive bias is this process that goes on that will allow the machine to make the decisions with less data? And could you just talk about inductive bias and if I'm describing it correctly?
Yeah, so I think the way you could think about it is, we sort of talked about this as a gap, right? There's sort of the data that you have, there's the conclusions that you want to draw, but normally the conclusions that we want to draw are not fully, justified by the data that we have. That's kind of like the definition of a learning problem, is a problem where you have to go from limited data to some other conclusion, and you sort of have to make your best guess at inferring what the right conclusion is based on the data. And so There's a few ways that you can try and bridge that gap. So one way of doing that is by having strong inductive biases, right? Those are the, these sort of factors that influence the conclusions that you draw. I normally demonstrate this with an everyday object, but I'm in my, okay, maybe I can use this. Okay, so if I tell you that this object is a blicket, I don't know how well you can resolve this, right? But now everyone in the audience, if I ask you to generalize as to whether this is a blicket, most of you are probably thinking, yes, that's probably a blicket, right? And the reason why you're able to do that is you're human beings. You can sort of make, inferences from small amounts of data. And those are your inductive biases at work, right? So when you thought about these things, you thought, well, they're actually both like slide advancers, right? But they're sort of small black technological objects. Those seem like reasonable things to have the same word for. You probably weren't thinking about hypotheses like things Tom is holding in his right hand, things that are, less than 30 feet above the surface of the earth, things that are located in Princeton, New Jersey, right? Those are all things that were equally logically true of the data that you were provided, but not hypotheses that you considered. And so your inductive biases are allowing you to go from the limited data that you had to the conclusion that you want to draw. And so a lot of contemporary machine learning research has taken a different kind of perspective. If we think about the human case as going from small amounts of data to these conclusions with these strong inductive biases, a lot of contemporary machine learning research is kind of going in the opposite extreme and saying, well, let's make that gap as small as we can by getting as much data as we possibly can. And so that's the kind of trend where, these very big language models, like the kinds of things that Annie was talking about, are being trained on sort of huge amounts of linguistic data, the equivalent of like thousands and thousands of years of continuous speech. Whereas a human child learns, an equivalent sort of mastery of language from 5 years of, getting some, somewhat random exposure from people talking in their household.
But the inductive bias the machines are learning to bring to this is what's called the black box, essentially. That's a mystery, right? The machines are learning a kind of inductive bias, but we don't understand how they're doing it. Is that fair? So we don't really understand what the machines are doing.
Yeah, so one thing that's true of a lot of current machine learning methods, like artificial neural networks, the kinds of things that Grayson has explored in his work, is that it's very hard for us to know what the inductive biases of those systems are. So they have this strategy, we'll not focus on engineering the inductive bias, we'll focus on giving the system lots of data, and we'll use a system that we don't know much about what its biases are like, but we're going to assume that they're not too substantial. I think Grayson's work has sort of shown, if you take a neural network and you train it to do something that seems like a relatively straightforward sort of task, even just doing that can exhibit some biases that system might have.
Okay. And so I think Max Tegmark calls it the intelligibility of intelligence. The fact that we can't understand that black box is daunting to us civilians out here, in that the landscape that machine learning is taking over in terms of allocating credit ratings and various things becomes a kind of inherent issue, right?
Yeah, although I would say that's something which is a characteristic of some contemporary machine learning methods. There are other methods that are much more interpretable, and there's a lot of work in AI at the moment trying to make uninterpretable methods more interpretable. I think in some ways, actually having non-transparent and uninterpretable black box systems is an advantage for people who want to make strong claims about the potential of AI, because when you don't understand something, you also don't understand what its limitations are. And so as a consequence, it's very easy for us to imagine that whatever the technologies we have now are going to solve all of the problems that we're interested in.
So Annie, when you're taking, I wanted to talk about Prometheus Firebringer, your piece that you're doing in collaboration with Aeschylus and natural language processing, perhaps. So you're taking a more advanced natural language processing platform than you used in the Noam Chomsky Foucault piece, right? And you are you're collaborating with the machine to write this play. So you and the machine in the Hello, Hi There piece we saw, you found this incredible irony and humor in both this conversation and in natural language processing. So do you think that's the collaboration between you and the machine learning that's finding that humor and irony? And is the same, are you working toward the same thing with Prometheus Firebringer? Or what?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I certainly found is that a dumb AI somehow can be really pleasurable artistically, because it gives a lot of, speaking of gaps, there's enormous gaps in the understanding that these things have. They have, in a way, no understanding. They're just doing little language games. And so it really gives an opening for the audience's creativity and intelligence to be activated, which is a pleasure. You know, the experience of the audience watching these things is one of creating meaning, having the meaning sort of fall apart on you, having the meaning be unexpected because of the sort of logic of the algorithm doesn't match your expectations of your logic. So all of those things can be funny. They can sometimes be a little melancholy. They can sometimes you know, be a little bit discomforting or awkward or uncomfortable. You know, I mean, like there's a lot of different possible ways that can feel to encounter that logic. The new stuff like GPT-3 is sometimes so plausible that I'm wondering a little bit about it. Like I'm wondering where the kind of artistic pleasure is. I've never really been a fan of art where it's like, wow, how'd they do that is your only response, where, you know, all you can do is sort of admire, there's something virtuosic happening and that's that. But so, you know, we haven't even really started yet. My collaborator, Sukanya Aneja, is the artist and machine learning programmer that I'll be working with. But we're both wondering, how do you find those like openings for the audience's creativity to have some space to play, so that the audience, you know, can kind of make their own narrative alongside what they're receiving from
Just to clarify, GPT-3 is the most advanced natural language processing platform available. It's not open source code, but it's available to the public to use. So you're using that.
Yeah, exactly. But we'll be doing our own fine tunings of it, presumably, but, you know, we don't quite know yet exactly what approach we'll take.
I mean, just as I sort of see Grayson's work as kind of inherently adversarial, and that makes a lot of the dynamic of it. I do sense in your work, you go in and you use this, but you are unpacking certain things, whether you call it the patriarchy or the, so to speak, you know, just going back and remaking a Greek myth by the father of tragedy seems sort of dynamically disruptive, if you will. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I often start from the perspective that I'm trying to understand how these things work. And so I find a kind of, and maybe it's like a prompt for myself, I find an occasion to start looking into it. And, you know, maybe, as I sort of said earlier, I'm thinking a lot about dramatic structure. So I'm thinking about how information gets ordered and how that can become a form of storytelling in itself, and that those stories have a lot of power, which is maybe another way of thinking about some of the bias that like Grayson was talking about, this sort of other level of bias where we think that the structural assumptions are doing a lot of political work. Some of that political work may be hard for us to spot because it might be invisible, either by design or because the assumptions feel so natural. So when, you know, Aeschylus, yes, is like the sort of, you know, I guess what he's most famous for is like he invented that two characters, actually, this is also good for Grayson, that he invented that two characters could interact with each other and not just that a character on stage would talk to the chorus. So he, in a way, invented theatrical dialogue. And what his assumptions were about how to order information in a way that would make sense for an audience or be illuminating in some way or surprising, that I hope will have some interesting interactions with how machine learning algorithms will sort and order information. Maybe it's the guess, it's the question.
And also this whole relationship we have now, or engineers particularly have with this machine learning, where they're endowing this technology with this power. I find it very interesting. You're going back and looking at Prometheus, you know, the gods punish Prometheus for giving humankind the power of fire, if you will. So I don't know if that's conscious, but this question of the power of the technology and what it may heap back upon us seems central to the piece.
Yeah, absolutely. The Prometheus, when I found out that there was an Aeschylus, I knew about the first play, and then I discovered that there was a whole trilogy and that the final two plays were lost. And the third one, there was just this one line remaining. It seemed like a wonderful, I don't know, historical like nugget to play with. Yeah.
And I don't often go down the path of how art and science are alike, but I'm interested, what's come up as I've gotten to know all of you is this relationship between your practice, whether it be artistic or scientific, with simulation. So I just wanted to see, I know, Tom, you've talked about simulation of cognition, right? And how revealing that is. And Annie, you've talked about theater as a simulation. And Grayson uses simulation in so many tricky ways. And I wondered how you think of those in relation to each other, and maybe societally. Why are scientific simulations seemingly much more trusted than artistic simulations, if you will? Anybody want to tackle that?
Well, I'll just say quickly, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question. And it's why I sort of, for example, in the Why Don't the Cops Fight Each Other video, or like the sort of research that went into this, I see myself as applying the scientific method to get to the bottom of this question, essentially, which is like, okay, we can make two pedestrians, which that's the name that the developers give the just regular people in Grand Theft Auto. They can fight each other, no problem. You can like create two of them, give the requisite instructions, and they fight, right? And then the scientific method would be like, okay, let's take one aspect of this away and replace it with another one and see how the results change, right? And so that's like, you add one police officer, same thing. But then the second that you add, make it so it's two police officers, the whole situation changes. And so in a way, I'm like using the scientific method in order to give more legitimacy or something to this endeavor of like trying to get to the bottom of this. And so I think you can also kind of like leverage that script a bit as an artist in a way to get away with some things, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay. And then just in terms of the sort of 2 years from now, do we think we'll all be talking in the same kind of open way, or are we going to be prey to the machine letting us talk, if you will, or where are we headed, just for each of you to say? Tom, are you optimistic about this machine-human collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of reasonable anxiety about, things like machines taking people's jobs and these other kinds of things. I mean, I think the way that I think about that is that we should expect change, but I think we don't necessarily need to be pessimistic about the consequences of that change, right? Where, even as certain kinds of jobs become things that are done by automation, that's also going to create new opportunities for other kinds of jobs that we can't even imagine now, right? Just as the jobs of the 2020s are not the jobs that you might have imagined in the 1950s or something like that. I think one of the things that's changing is the speed at which those kinds of transitions happen, right? Where technology is, as illustrated by the picture that I showed, sort of rapidly accelerating some of those kinds of societal changes. But I'm optimistic in the sense that, as I said, I kind of think about this as really human intelligence and artificial intelligence starting to develop along slightly different tracks. And there are going to be kinds of problems that you want a human to solve for you, and kinds of problems that you want a machine to solve for you, in a way that allows us to have some sort of independent autonomy.
And You guys as optimistic?
Well, I just wonder whether we're going to be very good at distinguishing between those two kinds of problems, which ones we like to give to machines and which ones we like to reserve to people, or and I, at the moment we seem to be giving an enormous amount of power to these tools, maybe because we're still exploring what it is they can do, what they're good at, what they're not good at, how they work. But it does. I don't know, it reminds me a little bit of what Tom was saying in the very sort of beginning of this conversation about sort of cost-benefit analysis and the kind of rational actor theory or something. And that kind of thinking is really not very intuitive for most people, right? It's not actually how our brains tend to first approach problems. And yet it was proposed by many people as the way that we should approach problems. It's a huge amount of our legal system, for example, is built upon the assumption that that is how people make decisions. Turns out it's really not how people make decisions in their normal lives. And there's a lot of questions, I think, about some of the knockdown consequences that we don't think of as being a product of the tech industry. And I'm thinking about sort of environmental costs and political costs associated with mineral mining. A lot of resources are being used, again, in ways that we tend to think of these tools as sort of ephemeral and a little bit neutral in terms of their carbon footprint or in terms of other, costs, and that I think we might be running up against some limits relatively soon of on that level as well. So those are some of the questions I'm thinking about as we look to the future, like what what are some of the things that we're not paying enough attention to right now, maybe.
And Grayson, you've talked about what AI, the contribution of AI that it allows us to sift through and understand better what we have wrought as human beings. This notion that it actually allows us to reflect on what we've done. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think like what Annie is doing is a very interesting application of something like this. Of course, like what she's doing is much more complicated than, what I'm sort of thinking about when I think about this, which is that just like machine learning algorithms, they're trained on all of this data, this stuff that we have all created. And so we can use that as a way of kind of like when we ask it then to generate a piece of text or an image or to generate a label for a thing that the camera was pointed at, that's going to reveal to us a lot about the data that went in and what sorts of bias or whatever the system is then reproducing. And I think this, the question from before is super interesting to me also, in the sense that like, the question is kind of like, should we be worried about machines ruling our lives or something? This is like, a hyperbolic version of the question that you asked, but I would argue that we're already essentially, embedded in these sort of like deterministic algorithms that decide things like, even pre-computer, deciding things about how wealth should be sort of like distributed in a society, who makes what amount of money and so on. And I don't think that there's anything that's necessarily wrong with something like automation, for example. It's just that, when you automate someone's job away or something like this, there's like a certain amount of wealth or value that you're extracting from that situation, right? If you no longer have to pay a person to do a task that a computer now does, the question I think is, where does that wealth go that was generated? And if it's not redistributed in society to the extent that now we all have to work less because we have collectively automated certain aspects of our society, then there's a problem for sure.
Well, I want to hand it over to the audience for questions. Please put your questions in the chat box, or I don't know if we can put people's mic on or not. We didn't actually talk about that, but please put your questions in the chat box. I want to hand it over, but I want to say that at Max, what we're really interested in is bringing scientists and artists together so that those two perspectives can come together and both identify and inform these incredibly complicated scenarios we face in our everyday lives that, you know, I think we all know that there's a lot of trauma and turmoil in the world, partly because of these dramatic changes in our lives and these algorithms that are interfacing with our lives so deeply. So I'm just so grateful that these three minds have come together in this conversation, and that what the artist brings and the scientist brings is so complementary, not always exactly, you know, it's not at all the same, so it's really complementary. So thank you. So do we have any questions there? I know we have it from our, oh, in fact, I wanted to say, I forgot to thank our presenting partner, 1014, and it's the Space for Ideas, and they had a question about, is the artist a good mediator for what I'm talking about? Is the artist a good place to sort of look and think about these scientific innovations, if you will? Maybe I'll ask Tom that.
Well, I mean, I can respond from personal experience, which is that interacting with Grayson and Annie has meant that I've had interesting thoughts of exactly the kind that I always hope for. I think you know, creativity is an essential part of science, I think, in the same way that it is in art, and having novel avenues to getting perspectives and ideas that are the kinds of things that we can take back to the sciences is really worthwhile.
And you guys, where do you feel you're feeling, what's your role, and how is it frustrating or fulfilling?
You know, I think, you know, there's a kind of like, I don't know, I don't want to say this, it sounds almost like a joke, but like, you know, artists often are the kind of people who will spend a long time on problems that like no one else will bother thinking about, because there's no benefit to it other than the satisfaction of one's curiosity, like really no benefit. There's no, and I, you know, Tom might disagree and say that's exactly what we do in the lab, but you know, I do think that one of the things that artists can bring to these issues is a thinking along multiple tracks at once. So, you know, there's a kind of like embodied knowledge and a kind of emotional knowledge and a kind of technical knowledge, intellectual knowledge, and like, you know, those things can be addressed in an artistic research, not only all together, but also in terms of how they affect each other. And I think in some other forms, you know, thinking about, I don't know, scholarly writing, or in scientific research, where you might want to isolate questions in order to address them sort of in a more rigorous way, or maybe there would be possibly a tendency, again, Tom can correct me if I've got this totally wrong, but in my mind, in my imagination, you try to eliminate some of the noise around the questions you're working on. And in a lot of my work, like the noise is actually pretty valuable.
Right, and once you said to me, we were talking about the artists don't always know, they don't know what they're going to go in and find or what the answers they're looking for, and that's not scary. Whereas when a machine learning platform is just going in and tinkering around and moving forward without any logic behind it, it gets scarier than the artistic simulation, if you will.
Yeah, I think just to jump in, I mean, I think there are ways in which that's exactly true, that what Annie was saying, where I think some of the things that Grayson and Annie have been highlighting are the things that if you're a machine learning researcher, you say, that is error, right? We want to eliminate that. We don't want any more of that. And they're saying, that is interesting, right? And we want to look at that because that tells us something about, you know, human nature, and we can sort of reflect on it.
Okay, I have a question. I'm curious if the panelists have any thoughts about the difference between biases and choices. It seems like where we talk about in biases in coding, where we talk about biases in coding, we talk about an artist making choices. So it's kind of along these lines. So is it okay for artists to have biases, but machines shouldn't? Or artists making choices? Is there a difference between a code having bias and an artist making choices, is the question.
Well, I can think of two possible ways to address that. One would be that there's maybe something like the habits of mind you have as an artist, which you might want to shake yourself out of. So it's maybe the analogy might be with machines having biases, maybe less about artistic choice and more about artistic assumptions or ruts, or this is maybe a little bit orthogonal to the question, but I was just thinking about one of the ways that I have used working with computer software in my work is to actually push myself out of my habits, right? So that for exactly the reasons that Tom was sort of explaining before, a machine might offer me options that I would dismiss out of hand as being uninteresting. But once they're presented to me as I work with an algorithm, I might give them more attention and find something more valuable there that I wouldn't have expected. So that's one possible answer. I don't know. And then I guess the other thing I was thinking from the question was about power, right? Like, again, going back a little bit to the previous question, that one of the big differences is that nobody that artistic exploration is a pretty safe space to explore a lot of these questions, and there can be some really pretty terrible consequences to allowing machines to make decisions for us, whereas there's really usually not many terrible consequences to playing around in a simulation with machines making decisions, or so there's a differential on that level as well.
And that was from Olivia Reiner, that question. And I have a question from Pranab Das that says, is there a link between art of about 4 an AI world and a new sort of artisanship in the creation, use, deployment of new computational tools? So is there a change in this notion, I think, of the individual auteur into a kind of new Grayson, will you collaborate with those algorithms?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I feel like I've never heard quite a satisfying answer to this, but so I don't really know. I mean, one thing that I'll say, which is like adjacent to this, is that what I think, I personally don't think of it as like the computer being a collaborator. I think it's very much a tool, just like a painting or whatever, that I'm sort of like creating to get people to think about things personally. But I think what's really interesting about like software and or AI is that there's this idea that it creates or it enables a new form of rhetoric, in the sense that when you sort of like I don't know, use like visual print media to like distribute propaganda or something. It's like that's visual rhetoric, right? Like we see it, we see the words, we see the image, and we come to the conclusion, the argument that the visual print media is saying is like, yes, okay, we agree with this, or like, now I've identified this argument. Whereas now with software systems, video games and other software and like simulations, you can sort of render a simulation. You can like spin it up and let it go, and that simulation can be about an aspect of society or whatever, but by sort of like seeing it in action, in effect, sort of in its like incipient form, you can kind of like communicate ideas about systems more with higher accuracy or something, or more effectively. And so I don't think so much about, the authorship of the thing, but that this is like actually a new rhetorical mode that allows us to like mount a system and point to various aspects of that system as practitioners in like a more kind of complicated way.
Anything to add, Annie, about your collaboration with permission, or has it changed your notion of your, well, you always want to engage the audience, so it allows you to engage the audience more in the authorship, if you will. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think I got into a habit a while ago of thinking of it as a collaboration, but I should think more about it now, see whether my thoughts on it have changed. I think I still think of it as a collaboration precisely for the reason I sort of mentioned a second ago, that there are often possibilities that, once I've worked on like the system or the algorithm and the code is kind of humming along, like it's often showing me things that I would not have ever considered presenting to an audience. And that, because my stuff has tended to be sort of near real-time generated along with the audience watching it, that's often happening in a kind of live moment with an audience, that the audience and I are both experiencing something unexpected at the same time, which I think maybe gives it a feeling that I have like a partner up there who's also making some decisions.
I have a question from Kevin Trong. I want to first put to Tom and then everybody. In a world of endless information and possibilities, we need guiding principles to direct our choices. Perhaps the awareness of our death or need for meaning shapes our attention and choices on a deeper subconscious level. How do each of you think about the subconscious? I put this to Tom first because I know one of the first times I talked to him, he said he did not want to talk about the definition of consciousness. So he may not want to answer this.
No, I'm happy to talk about that. So, I mean, in the work that I do, we don't, part of the reason I don't want to talk about consciousness is we don't make a distinction between conscious and unconscious components of, or subconscious components of cognition in the way that I approach doing cognitive science. Plenty of other cognitive scientists do. But what I'm focused on are the computational problems human minds have to solve, what the solutions to those problems look like, and then how that helps us to understand human behavior, right? And so nowhere in that list was the word consciousness, right? It's really about, I'm sort of agnostic on whatever the actual process is by which those solutions are implemented in human brains. But I do think a key thing about the question here is sort of pointing to things like, one of the things I mentioned at the start, this sort of limitation of the human lifespan, which I think has a massive effect on the nature of human minds. And it has effects because it determines how much data a human mind can possibly hope to learn from. So that's going to influence exactly, in that equation of data you learn from and inductive bias, like how strong human inductive bias needs to be, right? An organism that lives less time has less opportunity to learn and has to have sort of more stuff built in, right? And a computer system, which can learn from, many, many hundreds of human lifetimes worth of data, can have a weaker inductive bias because it has data to replace it. It also influences the time scale over which we think and plan and operate, right? Where, an individual human being is learning these things, but then going to take action on those things. And so there's a kind of natural arc to a human life where you're going to spend some amount of time exploring the world and learning, and then some amount of time exploiting the knowledge that you've acquired, and then sort of taking whatever actions you're going to take on that basis. And so, there's a way in which human decisions are going to look very different at different points in that lifespan. And it's very relevant to understanding, that it's not just that human babies are just sort of terrible decision makers that just act randomly, and that, older adults are, like stuck in their ways and not interested in new things. It's that, in fact, those are adaptive choices based on where we are in our lifespan in terms of that trade-off between learning and acting.
So it's sort of hardwired into our awareness of death is hardwired into our wiring.
Yeah, it's like our awareness of death, or at least the fact that we have this kind of like finite horizon that we're operating over, is something that has an intimate influence on the way that we're going to approach every single decision we're going to make.
And you guys, is awareness of our death essential to our shaping our choices?
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I mean, it just seems interesting to me that the way that the question is presented, it almost is like views consciousness as like a determinate thing. Because we could artificially construct an awareness of death, right? Like if the system had a variable storing how much life it had and it was decreasing at every moment, we could create a system that like responds to that circumstance for sure. And so even in our kind of like conception of consciousness or subconsciousness, and by extension consciousness, I think, yeah, we're kind of viewing it in a particular way through a very particular cultural lens that sort of like aligns it with something like a machine or a computer.
Okay, and I have one last question for you all. Just in terms of your mentors, I was just curious if each of you would just list a few of your mentors so we all know what lineage you see yourself in before we break up today. Start with Annie.
I guess there's the mentors that I know in real life and the mentors that I have encountered through their work or writing. One he would not like it, and I think Norbert Popp is in the audience who knows exactly what I'm going to say. This person would really not appreciate at all to be called a mentor. I mean, he would object completely, and I think he's really right to object totally. But certainly the Dutch director Jan Ritsema had an enormous impact on my development as an artist. The way that I think about what artists should spend their time on and some approaches. I was coming from, sort of American theater background and, good, wholesome training at the Yale School of Drama. And when I started to encounter Jan and his work and his way of making work, it really opened up like a whole universe of possibilities to view art as another mode of thinking, another mode of learning about the world. And he encouraged the kind of broadest possible curiosity on my part. So, but don't call him a mentor.
Okay, you're part of his lineage. You're in the lineage, same lineage.
Oh, he's my friend.
And Tom?
Yeah, so I grew up in Australia and did a lot of sort of like math and science when I was in high school. But then when I went to university, I wanted to do something completely different. I was doing philosophy, psychology, and so on. And then I was lucky enough to come across a philosophy book written by somebody called Paul Churchland that really kind of, I was reading it, and the last chapter had this chapter about how people were using artificial neural network models to model minds. And I was like, that's amazing. You can use math to make sense of how minds work. And so I knew what I wanted to do. And then I cornered the one person on campus who did that kind of work at 9 a.m. on the first day of class after the summer when I'd been reading that book. And so his name was Mike Kalish, and I was very lucky to have him take me into his lab. And then when I was applying to graduate school, I worked with Josh Tenenbaum, who pulled the folder out of a big pile of this weird Australian guy who wanted to do these things. And so that was a lucky moment. And again, somebody who had, I think together we really worked out a whole perspective about how to answer some of these kinds of questions. And then he was also influenced by Roger Shepard, who was a great American psychologist, and really the first person who started asking this kind of question of like, how do we think about the nature of the problems minds have to solve and what their ideal solutions look like?
And Grayson.
Gosh, that's such a good question. I mean, I don't know, like when I think about someone to look at, like in terms of my career trajectory or something, I always think about Hidosh Earle, who's probably, greatest living artist, greatest artist of all time, something like this. But for like a more kind of, the person that I've been thinking about a lot just recently is Ursula K. Le Guin. I think that science fiction has been like very instrumental for me. And the thing I think I like about her, why I would say maybe she's a bit of a mentor, is that she, especially in the book, The Dispossessed, affords us like such a great way to look at our culture from the outside. And it's, something that's like so difficult to do. And she sort of renders that world. So maybe Ursula.
And so is there going to be a time in the next near future where we might reference a learning machine as an influence? Perhaps. And I just want to end with a question. We won't answer it, but I think it's such an interesting question. We'll end with a question. John Sturm asks, if art is so safe, why is it alleged that when Lincoln met Stowe, he said, "So you're the little woman who started the Great War?" Which is wonderful. So that sort of balances the power shift for a moment. But anyway, I thank you all for being here. I thank the audience for being here and staying with us. And it's been a pleasure to talk about this. And I think we end with a question because there are so many more questions than answers. But to have people like this looking into these questions and to have you audience interested in coming in and joining us in this conversation, I'm very grateful and I wish you all the best. And I hope to see you. We will have a different moderator on March 14th with the interspecies quest. And it's about how other species have intelligences that we're actually learning more about through machine learning, which is really exciting. All right, thank you all for being here. And we will say adios, goodbye, thank you.